Instead of 1 hour advance, we will be advancing now 140,160 hours. Welcome to 2030. Today we will be hearing from 4 possible dimensions in this time frame. We are lucky to get in protagonists who are able to give us first-hand account of what it is like in 2013, after 16 years of reform, counter-reform, political and economic uncertainty, and years of social unrest. Today, with us, the first one will be Dugald Hein, who is speaking to us from an undefined place in Europe on events that shaped Tiensta movement. The second one is Gunilla Lundahl, who will take us through a sequence of annual citizens' dialogues taking place in Tiensta since 2015. Following this, we will join a radio transmission in progress from 2030 featuring an anonymous feminist activist interviewed by Adam Tiensta. And following a break, our final protagonist will be Tor Lindstrand, who will speak to us on the wonderful fulfilled official 2030 Stockholm Urban Plan.
Yeah, so we're moving 140,000 hours in 160 minutes or something like that. And I just wanted to report that we lost one of our persons in the 5th dimension, who she couldn't really make it. We don't know where she disappeared, but we believe in another dimension. And so we can bring her report as well with our other 4 dimensions that we've got together today. So we apologize for that. We lost her signal. We think it might be due to a civil disaster or perhaps a natural disaster. So we're going to start with Dugald.
4 dimensions left, 4 parallel realities, of which we don't know which one you have encountered taking the trip from 2014 onward. What we know is that some were more welcome than others at the time, others more probable, while some had to wait for reality still to come. In the final part, we will therefore be returning to 2014, take a short break and use the opportunity to explore the potential within the fulfilled and unfulfilled dimensions initiated today, which is the one that will be allowed to make it into the future. But let's first turn to Dugald, reporting on the Tiensta movement.
Thank you for asking me to speak to you today. It has been a long time since it was possible to make a journey across Europe, such as the one that brought me here. And I suppose it will be a long time before I make such a journey again. I look around this hall and I see faces that I recognize from another life, an earlier life, or so it seems. Old friends. I look forward to your company in the days ahead. There are other faces that I look for and know that I will not see. Such is the passage of time, and ours has been a rough passage, though no rougher than men and women have had it in many a generation. And that, in a sense, is our subject today. You have asked me to speak about the Tiensta-rörelse, the Tiensta movement that grew up in the years following the events of 2017, the period we sometimes speak of as the Great Adjustment. When we think of Tiensta now, it has come to stand for, well, what exactly? I suppose if I had to describe it in one sentence, I would call it a turning away from the patterns by which we used to organize life and work. Patterns which were still taken for granted in the world in which my generation grew up. And as we know, this movement has been central to the story of how Sweden was able to cope, as all of our countries have had to cope, with the realities of getting poorer. So, in the next few minutes, I want to talk about why it should have been in a place like Tiensta that this movement began. And in order to address this, I will try to take you back to its earliest beginnings, to a world where it took hours rather than weeks to travel across this continent, where electricity came out of a hole in the wall at any time of day or night, with no need to think about where it came from. And where most of us were forced to sell half of our lives to entities run by people we would never meet in order to have a place to live, a refrigerator full of food grown by people we would never meet, and a holiday once a year to a country whose language we would never speak. So, the Tiensta movement. The first thing to say is that there is a very long list of people who are better placed than me to talk about this subject. The only advantage I have is that I am here. True, I was in Sweden during those years. 18 years now I've lived there, the greater part of my adult life. But I've only been in Tiensta on a handful of occasions, and most of those were in the early years, when we still lived close to Stockholm. The story of the return to the villages, the de-urbanization that gained momentum by the early 20s, is another part of the Great Adjustment, but it is a story that is less particular to Sweden, and we can leave it for another day. We use the word movement to describe a set of ideas and ways of organizing that came together in Tiensta and a number of the other miljonprogram suburbs in Sweden's major cities at the end of that decade. It caught people's imagination, and it brought practical answers to the questions of how to make life work under circumstances that were becoming harsher. But it did not resemble a social movement of the kind that some of us remember from last century. There were no marches or demonstrations, no stunts to grab the attention of the media, no mass lobbying of politicians to demand that they do something about the situation. Because by this time, the idea that they could take control or fix things, well, it had become a bad joke. Many of the practical elements associated with the movement just sound like common sense to us. Think about food. We take it for granted that most of what we eat has been grown and made by people whose names we know, people we can stop and talk to, who will ask us to help them in the times of year when many hands are needed. And this was not the case, but what you find if you look back to those years is that there were already small pockets of activity around the edges. People were growing food for idealistic reasons, or because they were far-sighted, or as a lifestyle choice, or as a hobby, or because they had found a little luxury market where people who were uncomfortable about the reality of where their food came from would spend a little extra to feel like there was an alternative. There are a whole lot of different reasons why people were growing food 20 years ago, but what happened is that as the food in the supermarkets got more expensive and the supply chains got less reliable, you stopped needing a special reason to get involved in growing food. It became an everyday reality, something people did. That shift happened very quickly, without a lot of fuss, over a couple of years. And looking at the area around Tiensta, there were urban farming projects that had been getting funding, and then, of course, the funding wasn't there anymore. So people just took over the projects themselves. There was no shortage of land once you started looking at it that way. Now, already you can see the difficulty of getting to a satisfactory description of the origins of the Tiensta movement, because this story about food is one that could be told from any of 100 places in Europe. We can get closer to the heart of what the movement would become, to the reasons why it mattered, by looking at another small example from the earliest stages. The text known as the Declaration of the Right to Useful Unemployment. It was written by a group that had met in a Swedish language class in Tiensta, a class for new immigrants. It spread online and became one of the reference points for the development of a new way of thinking about work. To understand the Declaration, you have to go back 6 months before it was written. You have a group of adults, many of them who had left behind lives they would not gladly have chosen to leave, stuck in a class which they were required to attend for 7 hours a day. It was meant to prepare them for becoming part of Swedish society, but mostly it felt like a waiting room. Whole afternoons spent sitting around with nothing to do. And on one of those afternoons, they had decided to write a letter of complaint, asking for changes to the course. But no one was sure exactly who they should complain to. And as the conversation continued, as they talked about what was wrong, as they talked about this sense of boredom, they began to recognize the boredom they were talking about as only a concentrated version of something that was all around them, in their apartments and their weekends, hanging around on the streets in the evenings, packing the carriages on the subway. On the one hand, all the systems they were connected to seemed to be focused on making them into useful employees, even if the job interviews they went to were mostly a disheartening experience. But on the other hand, the people they knew who had jobs mostly felt like the work they did was meaningless. And anyway, everyone knew that there were fewer jobs now than a year ago, and a lot more people looking for work. Somebody made a joke about it being better to be bored and have nothing to do than to work every hour of the day and still be bored. At least, it started as a joke. But it became an idea, another way of looking at their situation. And that afternoon, instead of writing up a list of complaints and suggestions as they had planned, they used the board at the front of their classroom to start listing things they wanted to learn, and then listing all the things that people in the group had done in their old lives, and people they had met since they arrived in Tiensta who they thought might help. And from there, they started to organize themselves into a school within a school. And it was the same group who would go on 6 months later to write that declaration. It's not a dramatic story, but there are two themes here that you hear again and again when people talk about the Tiensta movement. First, there's the shift from making suggestions or complaints or demands to the school, the system, the government, and towards a kind of collaboration that assumes that whatever possibility of change might exist belongs here among this group of people who find themselves together in the situation. It's a group of people that includes those working inside the system. One of the authors of the declaration was a teacher in that school. But it doesn't assume that the insiders have so much power to make things work. So that's the first theme, a shift of agency, you might say, to the people who happen to be present. The second is a shift of perspective. Instead of seeing the hours of the day in which they had to be in school as a waste of time, they saw it as a space of possibility, a platform they could use to start. I'll say a few words about the context out of which it came. Why did it start in a place like Tiensta? And why did it spread as far and as fast as it did? To take the second question first, because it is the simpler of the two. It spread because of the historical moment in which we found ourselves. Again, I ask you to think back to the middle of that decade. The crisis that had begun in 2008 seemed finally to be over. Sweden was one of the countries that felt less affected. And for a few years, it really looked as though the whole global political economic system might be back on track. But of course, we all know what happened next. And in hindsight, there were plenty of clues. Even while the system was working according to its own standards, you could see the gap opening between the official story of prosperity and the realities of people's lives. The promise of economic progress, that each generation would grow up better off than its parents, once the economy collapses, there is generally less to do, making it a good time for the naturally idle and a bad time for those predisposed to keeping busy. The ability to stop and smell the roses, to let it all go, to refuse to harbour regrets or grievances, to confine one's serious attention only to that which is immediately necessary, not to worry too much about the rest, is perhaps the one most critical to post-collapse survival. So much for the conditions within which the movement spread. There remains the question of why it started where it did. As I said at the beginning, Tiensta is not a place I know personally, so what follows is speculation, though speculation informed by what I've read and heard from others, and also by experiences elsewhere which seem to offer parallels. With that caveat, I have 3 suggestions towards an answer. First, I have spoken about the shift in agency that characterised the movement. A shift away from asking, when are they going to do something about it, towards an assumption that the answer starts with us, here. This did not come from nowhere. It came out of political and social realities that had been building for a long time, and it makes sense that it would be in a place such as Tiensta that this crystallised, a place where those realities were coming to the surface. I remember my first year in Sweden, back in 2012. We were living in the centre of Stockholm then. When friends came to visit from England, they would have this rose-tinted view of social democratic Scandinavia. I used to tell them, what you're seeing is more like Skansen. It's an open-air museum of social democracy. Of course, most people in Sweden had a sense that things had changed, but a lot of the Swedes I met back then were too busy paying attention to the housing market, treating their homes as gambling tokens in this delusional casino that we had convinced ourselves was reality, to really notice what it meant, the ways in which the system had been hollowed out. And if there was anywhere that this reality gap was going to break out into the open, it was in the suburbs, on the Miljonprogram estates, these places that had been built towards the close of the era in which social democracy meant something. Their decaying structures a concrete metaphor for what was happening to the country. So if the idea of a they who could fix things was turning into a bad joke, even before everything that happened in 2017, it was in places like Tiensta that people were paying attention. My second suggestion is more of a hunch, sparked by the memory of a conversation I had 25 years ago in England with a man who was then in his 60s. He had spent his life living and working on a council estate in a large city, an estate that was classified as having all kinds of social problems. For 40 years he had been working with young people on that estate, and he told me how, from the 90s onwards, he had seen a stream of short-term projects coming into his area from outside. Organisations would turn up and run graffiti workshops or DJ classes for the teenagers. He would always get talking to the people coming in to run these projects. He'd ask them what they knew about the area. And what he found was that they could tell him about the categories of deprivation that it fell into, the reasons why they were being funded to come here and try to improve the area. But the one thing they never had any idea of was that 30% of the adults on his estate had a university education. For me, that summed up a way of seeing places and the people who live in those places, seeing them only in terms of needs, indicators of deprivation, the things that were lacking and the things that were wrong. It was a mentality that shaped almost all the work that was getting funded. And I don't know enough about Tiensta to say for sure, but it feels like some of the energy of the Tiensta movement came from pushing back against that way of seeing. There's an insistence instead on starting from the things that are already present within a place, the skills and resources and experience, and the time that people have on their hands. Things that could easily be overlooked or undervalued or defined in ways that make them look like problems. Now, what you see as the movement develops is an approach to collaborating with the parts of the system that were still standing and with the people on the inside who were still there. But this collaboration had to be based on a new kind of relationship, a new way of working together. Because to say that a place shouldn't be defined in terms of its problems, its needs, its deprivations, could easily just be an excuse for the withdrawal of funding and services that was already going on. But in the hands of the people who live and work in a place, there can be something very powerful about redefining that place in terms of its strengths and its capacities. I have one more suggestion for why a place like Tiensta came to play such an important role in the recent history of Sweden. This has to do with the kind of difficult adaptation that Swedish society has had to go through. The rose-tinted view of Scandinavian social democracy may have been wishful thinking on the part of my friends, but it seems fair to say that Sweden came further than anywhere else in realising the vision of a society in which the state could be relied on to protect you in times of need. What is less well understood, at least outside of Sweden, is that this was also probably the most individualistic society the world had ever seen. It would be easy to suggest that this radical individualism was a consequence of social democracy, but this is too simple. There's a strong argument that it was the unusual tendency towards individualism in Swedish culture that made possible the project of the folkhem, the people's home, in the first place. Nonetheless, the experience of that project and its legacy intensified those tendencies to individualism. Never before had it been possible to live so completely independent of relations to other people. But the price of this was a dependence instead on large impersonal systems. And as those systems began to unravel, that price became more obvious. This is not a uniquely Swedish phenomenon. We can recognise something similar in much of Northern Europe, and even in the countries of the former United States. In fact, in the early years of this century, experts on public health had started to speak about loneliness as an epidemic affecting the Western world. The evidence for the damage to our physical and mental health was well documented. Yet, at the same time, in the choices we were making about how we spent our money and what we did with our time, it seemed that we were choosing to be alone, or at least that the kind of lives we had were incompatible with living together. In Stockholm, as in many Western cities in the period before the Great Adjustment, the size of the median household had dropped to one person. One of the defining features of the Tjeneste movement, and indeed of many of the ways we have found to make life work in the years since, has been the need to learn to live together again. We've had to rethink some of the things we thought we knew about ourselves, about the shape of history, the things we thought of as progress, and not least our ideas about our cultures. And one of the things we recognise is that culture is deep and slow changing, a powerful force, but it's not fixed once and for all, especially when it is at odds with deeper layers of our heritage as humans, as these sociable animals that we are. It has been uncomfortable at times, awkward, especially for my generation and those older than us, this journey back from the radical individualism which we thought of as modern. But part of what has made that journey possible is the presence within our societies of those whose cultural roots lay elsewhere than Northern Europe, those with a living memory of how life works in societies held together by mutuality and an interdependence on and with the people around you, with all of the difficulties and discomforts that this can involve. No one who has lived through all of this can have an overly romantic idea of what it means to have to make life work with the people amongst whom we find ourselves, whether that is families or neighbours, whether it is in the country of our childhood or somewhere far enough away that the seasons will never feel familiar. Yet, the rhythm of the seasons has changed so much since we were young. Even those of us who still live within a day's walk of the place they were born find themselves in a strange country. And if we've made it through these years, it is due to the kindness of strangers. Certainly, for the country in which I chose to settle, the country which is still Sweden, though a very different Sweden to the one in which I arrived, those who had come from elsewhere, the new Swedes, had a disproportionate role to play in helping us relearn the skills of living together and finding our way through the unknown territory of this century. For this reason too, then, it makes sense to me that it was in a place like Tjeneste that the movement began, which has come to stand for the journey that Sweden has made.
I would like to invite Gunilla Lundahl to join us and take us to the second dimensions, which she documented for 15 years.
Our dialogues, making nets, building our commons, strengthen our manifoldness, establishing just this Swedish model. How could that transition happen? First, political change in 2014 meant broader insight towards the need for a radical social change. It opened up for the establishing an urban laboratory for testing concrete ways to put things upside down. Second, resources in Tensta groups that were seeds for the engagement in the future were assembled in, around and outside Tinsta Konsthall already in 2014. Kvinnocenter i Tensta Hjulsta, Ross Tensta Gymnasium, Livstycket, Blåhuset, KITH, Artoteket, Järva-projektet, Konsthallsklubben, KTH i Tensta, The Silent University, Megafonen, Action Archive i Tensta, Spånga Fornminnes- och hembygdsgille, Tensta Library, Kurdiska föreningen, Den Gulliga föreningen, and a whole range of groups around different undertakings in Tensta. Third, basic income. Fourth, the inhabitants, the owners of land and buildings. 5, Järvalyftet transformed into a fund for social actions managed by the inhabitants. 6, Commission for academies and art schools to help to make way for new laws, regulations and habits, to assist in documentation, performing and implementing of new structures, helping in tactics and strategies. 7, one theme, 1 year, 1 step, 15 dialogues pointing toward the future for our children. Here are some notes about the 15 years long way to 2030 to today and this new Swedish model.
Kommer att ligga innanför tullarna inom
Nej,
15 år.
verkligen inte. Verkligen inte. Jag är lite nyfiken här. Du ligger ju bakom så väldigt många initiativ, antirasistiska och feministiska. Kan du inte berätta om hur du startade? Vad var det här med Instagram-kontot Svartkvinna? Kan du inte berätta lite mer om det?
Jo, men under 2013 så hände många saker som fick mig att börja tänka till. Jag ville få folk att börja prata med varandra om andra människors verklighet. Och jag valde att ta upp mina upplevelser och mina vänners upplevelser och flyttade ut. Jag är ju från söderort och hade hoppats på att komma ännu närmare tullarna. Men ja, det var tiden med utförsäljning.
Ja.
Så jag hamnade på nedre botten i Tensta. Och jag var inte alls särskilt intresserad av att bo där då. Men idag är jag väldigt glad över att jag faktiskt hamnade i Tensta.
Okay. Hur var det då att flytta till Tensta? Var det som du hade förväntat dig eller?
Ja, kurs på matematik till exempel. Och då missade de ju den här fördjupningen i historia till exempel. När
Och tillhörande monolog från Svärvolte. Just nu så befinner jag mig i Radiohuset.
Som ena ögat öppet, jag kan verka snäll. Jag vill ha min axel, ge min spegelbild. Helt vild, du vägrar möta mörker för jag är din hotline, dina rader. Fader, förlåt mig om jag syndar.
Vi möter varit så många flyktingvågor här nu.
Programmet lider mot sitt slut. Jag tänkte avsluta med en låt som är starkt kopplad till det vi har pratat om här idag med Svartkvinna. Att det handlar om att agera.